Welcome to AskPsychSessions, where we ask some of the best teachers in psychology questions from you, our audience. If you would like to send in a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions, all lowercase, no spaces. And here's our next question.
Today, we're getting a second perspective on our question, and it's going to be with Dr. Stephen Roberts, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Stanford. Dr. Roberts, I wanted to get in touch with you about the question about students in intro psych pushing back a bit on the degree to which a lot of the history of psychology is white and male, and maybe if you can touch on how we can help students think about the historical context versus moving forward. And for the listeners, the reason that I wanted to contact you is that I ran into your work, your research, which is aligned with this in a different way. So please feel free if you want to answer the question generally and or touch on some of your research that speaks to this.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, important question that I think about a lot, and that a lot of people on our end, at least here at Stanford, think about as well. And so I teach, I'm one of our teachers of Intro to Psychology, and I started teaching the class last year. And one thing I noticed very quickly, and it's mostly a product of the history of psychology in many ways, that a lot of the people who we would show in our lectures are often white men. And one question is, well, that was a bit concerning to me because many of our students are not white men. And if we are introducing people to this field of psychology, it would be great to give people role models or people who they can identify with so they could see themselves as future researchers or future psychologists. And there's a lot of research on how, if you see yourself or your identity represented in a field, it would inspire you or motivate you to feel like it's a realistic goal for you. So we've started working on switching out some of the images, making sure that we have more Black, Latinx, women's, people of varying orientations and identities represented in our slides, either as researchers or just if we're giving a general scenario of, let's say, for some reason we're talking about driving a car, then we could make sure that maybe the person who drives a car is an Asian woman or an Asian man, just someone who represents more diversity. Now, to your question about pushbacks, I think we've experienced mostly pushback with our PhD students, our TAs, the teaching assistants, who think about these things more critically, who have been in psychology for a while and will maybe push back and encourage us to diversify our images. I think we've seen less pushback, and maybe it's because less pushback with undergraduates, and it could be maybe that undergrads feel less vocal or that they are less empowered, that they can't say anything, but definitely less pushback there. However, what I have realized is that whenever we put up more diverse images and have greater representation, students will inevitably come up and express gratitude and thanks to that. And I can think of two quick anecdotes. One, we were just in class, we were talking about brain surgery, and I decided to swap out one of the images, and instead of having the brain surgeon be a white man, the brain surgeon was a Muslim woman with a hijab on. And afterward, one of the students came and told me that it was the first time she had seen someone of her identity represented in a lecture, and that it was very meaningful and impactful to her. So we definitely seen that appreciation. And in one lecture, we were talking about Christina Olson's great work on the Trans Youth Project and children with transgender identities. And we're talking about, this concept or this reality. And after a student who identified as trans came up and just really thanked us and appreciated us for making the space and making the time to have the lecture be inclusive to them. So even though we don't see undergrads push back as much, and I'm not sure why that's the case, and this is just within our sample, I've definitely experienced undergrads be very receptive and thankful whenever we have gone against the dominant narrative.
Thank you. That is a very helpful answer. And if maybe I can ask a practical sort of follow-up question. At my institution, we've recently been trying to up our conversations around diversity and inclusion and equity. And, one of the suggestions that I had that I felt would be helpful for me as I develop as a professional is a talk called, talking without tokening. And so for as a white identifying faculty member, I want to be conscientious of walking that line of not doing, and this is not my research field, but I know that, there's some data that show that I might over attribute in cultures that I don't identify with any sort of patterns to them, but not do it for myself, to sort of stay individualistic. So do you have advice for faculty if they're just sort of trying to start doing this work? Do you think it's best to do it implicitly, just sort of change out the images and don't talk about it? Or is it better to, just put it on the table and say, hey, listen, I realized my slides are full of white people. So I decided to, and hey, I know from the data that you noticed I was white because we can test that with reaction times. Do you sort of have suggestions about where to get started for people that maybe are not, that haven't been thinking this way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's something I haven't really thought about too much. So it's an interesting question. My intuition is that, and I'll speak, I guess, from how I do it in my class, someone who identifies as Black, multiracial. I try to do both ways. I try to just normalize certain identities in class. So in that example of the brain surgeon, I'm not explicitly labeling or referring to the person's identity. It's just, the topic is brain surgery, and it has nothing to do with social identities, but just seeing someone in that role, just adding that in there, kind of implicitly normalizing it, is one strategy. But I definitely, and I think that's an important component. And I think I would do a lot of that, and just making sure that there's different representations. And then I think it's also important at some point in a class, especially in a class like Intro to Psychology, or honestly, I think any class, to explicitly acknowledge the identities in our field, how things have changed, how they are not changing, which is another important component, and just explicitly acknowledging that reality and acknowledging your own positionality to the topic at hand, kind of breaking down that barrier, that curtain, and say, I'm also a figure, a character in this narrative, and here's my position and my role. So I think doing both, just normalizing certain identities in slides and lectures and how we communicate and who we think is a valuable person to even mention or include, but then also explicitly acknowledge how we can do better and explicitly acknowledge how important it is for, I think, everyone in our field to see the issue and to try to diversify our representation. So long story short, I think my strategy would be both to take an implicit and then add an explicit approach to it as well.
Great. Thank you. That is a helpful way to go about things. And I think really consistent. Some of the rhetoric around here has been just that we shouldn't just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also the idea of belonging. So I think when I sort of think about what you're saying from a framework of belonging, that's telling students like, hey, you belong in this space. And that's certainly how I would want my students to feel in the classroom. And I'm just going to predict people that are willing to listen to a podcast about how to be an effective teacher also want their students to feel a sense of belonging.
Yeah. And, if I could add 2 quick points. One, I think the issue of belonging is a very important one. If we look at, who, and these are, people in our field have been having this conversation for decades now, but if we look at who we include as participants, who are most of the authors, who are most of the editors, tend to be white Americans. And then when you look at, in leadership positions like editors, often white men. If you look at that, well, someone who's coming into our field, a younger scholar, and we know that the United States is becoming increasingly diverse. So a young scholar enters our field. If they don't see themselves represented in either of these roles, as an editor, as an author, or even as a participant, well, that might explicitly signal to them that your identity is not valued here. You have no chance of progressing in this field. So finding ways to break that down. And then two, I think that there are many places or many researchers or outlets that do explicitly take a more diverse approach. It's definitely not the case that, mainstream psychology doesn't do that. But if you look at, cultural psychology or psychologists from a more critical race perspective, if you look at more specialty journals, you'll find a huge variety of diversity of identities and thoughts. So finding ways to integrate work from those domains and bringing them into the mainstream, I think, is another useful strategy that I haven't been too great at. I don't think, and I'm trying to be better at, but I don't think our field is great at that. So I think those are two other useful strategies.
Those are great strategies. I agree, and help us move towards the APA undergraduate goals would also be consistent with those for those people with their assessment lens on. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat today, and I would encourage people, if they're interested in learning more about this, to look at your work. So thanks for chatting. Take care.
Thank you.